So I prefer wooden grips. I find that a wooden grip, for me, feels better in the hand. Certainly with messes, the messer being a knife, or technically a knife, is constructed with a slab tang. And so like even like a modern kitchen knife, the facing plates here will be riveted straight to the slab tang. And these are generally in basic messes wood. When we start to see messes become more ornate and more expensive and more finely crafted towards the end of the 15th century, they can often be made of walrus ivory. So there's some cases where there's silver included on them. And again, this goes from being a simple farmer's tool to becoming a symbol of the new middle class, symbol of one's culture.
Bob, did you know that walrus ivory was a preferred, not for all, but preferred material for many Persian shamshirs? Do you know why?
Yes.
I'm sure you do.
I wouldn't know. I don't know why.
If you sweat, when you have a bazuban, they have sometimes gloves, sometimes not, but he is always left naked. So when you sweat, and sometimes they even spit, and you have to touch walrus, it sticks.
It sticks. That's very interesting. That's certainly given me some new information for why messes are fitted with them. Then I do prefer a plain grip because I do find that it actually allows it feels better in the hand.
Is it one-edged? Is it single-edged messer?
So all messes are single-edged. They have a very short clipped edge like a Bowie knife.
Yes, I see.
The most interesting thing about the messer for me is messer directly reflects social change in 15th century Germany. As time progresses, the messer changes with society, not only in terms of its use, but also as a symbol of one's manliness, refinement, culture, bravery, honor. The messer moves from being a simple farming tool to becoming very much the symbol of German manhood. And the systems of messer fencing, even though the weapon is a peasant weapon, this isn't a weapon for war. It's related to the falchion, but this is a civilian sidearm. And the systems of messer fencing are perhaps, and I'm going to go out on a limb, perhaps the most comprehensive fighting systems developed in Europe ever. The reason I say that is when we come to 1478, a German priest by the name of Johannes Le Kuschner compiles all of his messer knowledge into a book. So you have a vicar who's a messer fencer who writes a book about messers. And this book is hundreds of pages of technique, principles, very, very, very detailed. And in fact, with the messer, we see the foundation for every cutting sword. Every cutting sword you can apply messer methodology to, because it's a very, very solid, simple, dependable methodology. What makes messer interesting is that messer itself as an art is built from grappling. It's built from grappling. Like the Colt 45, this is the equalizer of medieval Germany. Anybody armed with one of these has as good a chance against a bigger, stronger, fitter opponent. This is carried as an insurance policy. If you're having to ride to market, you're having to go through the woods, on your way, if you're herding animals or you're hunting, you'll find one of these. You've got a light sidearm weighing less than a kilogram that is capable of delivering very strong cuts, even though it's quite short, thrusts, and it has the defensive capacity to protect your hand with this third axis. Interestingly, this originally would have been a nail hammered in or peened in to a hole in the cross furniture, and in German was referred to as the Nagel. So it is just it was a nail, sometimes a Wehrnagel or defense nail. So they're a very, very clever weapon, clever tool. But what we see in Messer, and certainly in the last few years of my own study, has completely made me revisit my approach to fencing, completely, in its entirety. And this is strongly related to the morality of teaching martial arts. And that's a subject that we will talk about,
yes.
I believe.
Okay, so you mean that they could defend themselves with the Messer against the longsword? Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, the Messer, in fact, when we look at Messer manuscripts, and there are very simple manuscripts that only maybe show half a dozen different examples of fighting with the Messer, to some which are, for example, the what is referred to as the Glasgow manuscript, contains a section on Messer which is 11 exercises with the Messer, and in those 11 exercises effectively teaches an entire usable system. By the time we come to Johannes de Kushner, 1478, and he writes a second version in 1482, we have a massive amount of Messer material, a huge amount of material to work with, and very clearly written, clearly illustrated, but not only with the technical aspects, but also the tactical aspects, the self-discipline, the developmental aspects that we need to consider when we're fencing. These are holistic manuscripts. And they're very interesting in that respect. Even if you're not necessarily swinging a mess around for exercise yourself, they're an interesting, or I would say vital. They give a vital insight into the mindset of the 15th century martial artist. And again, we have to remember that at this point that these weapons are in daily use. Not that, and again, it's something I'll talk about, not that there is an omnipresent threat of deadly assault, but that these are almost in the way that an armed society is a polite society, that these are carried openly, and everybody knows that everybody else is carrying a Messer. And so the resolution for dispute is fairly codified. And I would recommend a book called The Martial Ethic in Early Modern Germany. Is essential reading if you're interested in the subject. But certainly that's my most recent studies have re-informed me to the way I teach now, and the emphasis I place on certain things when I teach. Because as an instructor, teaching effectively the martial use of a machete is widely open to misuse. Teaching the wrong person, we have problems. So we have to ask ourselves, and when we look at the manuscripts, in fact, we find the answers. They're very clear. Even 500, 600 years ago, there is a very clear set of rules that there are expectations for one's own conduct. And I think this is important that it informs certainly what we do today as recreationists.
Yeah. Bob, let us just stick to the weapons. We come back to these ethical code, please. What else? So you teach longsword, you teach Messer, and you told us that Messer has lots of techniques in it. Yes. And what else do you teach? Could you show us?
So I can't show you a poleaxe because they're actually in a hole which is locked, or a spear. But I do have an arming sword. So smaller version of the longsword. Again, it's got quite a pronounced grip, about 2 spans. So we can put 2 hands in it if we wish, but generally this is used single-handed. double-edged, point, cross, strong cross, and a strong pommel. This one, disc-shaped pommel, used single-handed, and generally used in conjunction with a small left-hand shield known as a buckler. And this type of fencing is also is a very interesting method of fencing, which we found is far older than we thought. We find manuscripts for sword and buckler fencing in Western Europe dating back to the beginning of the 14th century, so around about 1300. And sword and buckler fencing survives right the way up to 1600 and beyond. George Silver in 1599 writes about sword and buckler fencing. It's a big thing in Elizabethan England. But sword and buckler fencing, we know that there is and certainly from some of the archaeological finds, that there is a sword and buckler tradition in Europe that dates back to at least the Iron Age, if not earlier. Very clever combination. Small shield covers the weapon hand predominantly, and the emphasis being on working from the bind of the sword, where the shield is covering the weapon hand and allowing you to move around the opponent's weapon. But again, not a particularly heavy weapon. This one's about a kilogram, slightly more robust than the Messer, but fairly much the ubiquitous sword of the period. This is it's a very typical type of weapon. So yeah, the almond sword is and interestingly, when we look at Messer manuscripts, we often find that when because we've got to think again, there's no delete button. We often find that when a manuscript is, in some cases, certainly when a manuscript has been copied, or the information has been adapted from a different manuscript and they're writing onto their own page, we find examples, for example, where the word Schwert has been written by mistake, crossed out, and Messer written above. So Messer and arming sword are largely interchangeable, apart from the lack of a nagel on the arming sword. But again, with an arming sword, I would generally be using it in conjunction with something in the left hand, and that would be a shield or a buckler. We don't, and certainly in the period I'm looking at and that I'm interested in, we don't at this point really see anything with a sword and dagger, and that comes later. That starts to emerge in the 16th century.
So did I understand you correctly? You said you found the materials on sword and buckler from the Iron Age?
So we see the images certainly, and there's a beautiful image discovered in a tomb uncovered, I believe, in 2015, which didn't become publicly known about until 2019, in a tomb near Pylos or Pylos. And the Pylos hoard, which was a hoard of burial goods interred with a warrior who was known, I believe, was known as the Phoenix warrior. And one of the items that they found was a carved gemstone, an agate. And on this agate was this fantastic, beautiful image of two men in combat, one with a spear and a very large shield, who was being overtaken by a warrior armed with a typical Bronze Age rapier type thrusting sword. What I refer to Bronze Age rapiers, not in the same sense as a Renaissance rapier, but predominantly a thrusting blade of a fairly long triangular form. But he's bypassing the spearman with his shield over his shoulder, almost in a punch, and he's coming in over the top to hit him right through the clavicle. And the buckler he has in his left hand is perfectly illustrated. This beautiful little buckler, and we know that in Ireland, and certainly when in the project I was involved with Newcastle University, that in Bronze Age Ireland, there were leather shields, leather bucklers being used alongside bronze swords. They found a number of examples of what they call the Clun Bryn style, which are they're boiled type, as far as I understand. I'm not an expert in Irish Bronze Age finds, but the shields were about maybe 30 centimeters across, with a raised, a tooled raised ridge, circular, running almost like concentric rings with quite a pronounced raised boss, all fashioned from one piece of leather. And then
could you tell us a bit about this project you did with the university, you worked on with the university? What was that exactly?
Certainly. So that does segue in quite nicely, because I was approached in 2016 to assist with a project at Newcastle University, known as the Bronze Age Combat Project, headed up by Professor Andrea Dolfini in the Department of Archaeology, Classics and Ancient History. I hope I've got that right, in that order. And they were looking at, or looking to explore wear patterns on the edges of surviving bronze swords. And they had done some experiments where they had taken reproduction bronze swords of a type found actually not far from where I live, from where I'm from in Northumberland, type of Bronze Age sword called the Ewart Park type, which is a beautiful, one of the most beautiful swords I believe personally ever created. It was a leaf type blade pattern, with a very distinct flaring towards the tip, and they wanted martial artists who understood swords to look at them and handle them and optimize and look at try to figure out their optimal use. And on the back of that, we were asked to devise a methodology for an experiment in which we would play with some martially effective techniques to see whether we could replicate the damage found on originals. And to cut a long story short, I'm delighted to say we replicated not only the damage found on the originals, but the actual locations on the blade where they were found as well, which was quite surprising. The paper is available. I'll certainly make a link available to the paper, which was released last year. So the paper was written by as a PhD thesis by now Dr. Raphael Herman, and it got a worldwide blitz of attention, a huge response. I believe it ended up in Live Science and the Smithsonian magazine. So this kind of experimental archaeology, really the first time that historical fencers such as myself have been actively asked to participate in a purely academic study, to provide almost an experimental archaeological approach, but based upon the knowledge that or working with the knowledge that we have of how swords work. And it's easy for me to say that it's fairly obvious how a sword works, but when I actually look back at it and reviewed it, there are certain things that aren't immediately noticeable and are actually, in fact, are counterintuitive. And we certainly found that with the bronze swords in the way they were gripped. And there was the very interesting thing with the hilts of these, with the crosses of not the crosses, sorry, the shoulders of these swords. They almost had an anthropomorphic type of appearance with almost a U shape at the ricasso of the blade. So roughly where the bronze blade began here, there was a wooden shoulder that kind of rose up either side and formed a U shape. And we discovered that by putting our thumb into it, which is something that you do with the messer as well. these bronze swords, rather than being gripped like a hammer and used to chop, when you put your thumb on like this, they become almost precision point tools. And I strongly believe, strongly contend that certainly these types of bronze swords were optimized for thrusts, mainly because of the malleability of the material. That if you just strike them together, they bend. But when you thrust with a bronze sword in this fashion, it's a beautiful thing in terms of a martial movement. And we only have to look, as far ahead as the Romans or the early Roman Empire and the infantry tactics, where they're using the gladius and the scudum, and simply just opening up, thrusting, closing back up, and working like a machine. To see that the idea of using thrusts is favorable when you're fighting in mass formations rather than everybody swinging their weapon around. This study yielded a lot of very, very interesting, results.
It's very interesting, Bob, because maybe you find it interesting. We just published recently together with Dr. Arjmandi from our team. He's a nanotechnologist, a physicist, PhD in physics and nanotechnologies. And we published for a university in Turkey, in Kafka University. And we measured the mechanics of a curved sword, and also by swinging it. I mean, it's published, it's accessible now on my academia page. And by a physicist and a nanotechnology, the whole movement for the first time, what the sword creates, and in a simulation, and you can just watch that. This might be very interesting because from a fighting point of view, this. And now back to bronze swords. I'm sure you know that I've handled like hundreds and hundreds Bronze Age swords from Persia, Iran. We have many, I have handled many. If I say I handled close to 400, 500 from museums and measured them. And just back to, I'm talking about Iranian ones, right? There are two things I would like to mention, but I'm sure you know that. In China, did you know that they had what we know in folded steel?
Yes.
They also have the edges, which has more tin than so you see that. And then in Persia, we have some of them as well. And now it comes, many of them have nicks.
Yes, we found one of the really amazing things for me personally. Again, I talked earlier about the human journey and the human process. Neil Burridge is arguably the best worker in bronze for Bronze Age weapons certainly in Europe, if not the world today. And Neil made the replicas for the experiment. And of course, the edges themselves are annealed to the body of the sword through welding. And they have, as you said, a different composition, which makes them harder. What we found, what the team found from the experiment, was that with the best knowledge we have today, the hardness of the reproductions paled into insignificance to the originals. The originals were so much harder, and we have no, as far as I'm aware, even certainly I haven't heard anything, but we have no idea how they hardened the edges of their swords to these levels of hardness. And so it's remarkable to think that we were working with a reproduction of a 4,000-year-old technology